Well, good Monday morning, everybody. It is June 14th, and it's 2021 for those that are watching sometime in the future. We are in our second day in the 20th chapter of Acts. Today we're going to look at verses 7 to 12. We just took a little bit of a bite on Saturday, and we left Paul is traveling. He got just arrived in Troas is where we've left him. So he is in Troas now. And it's Paul's called, this section is called Paul's farewell visit to Troas. All right. And it does have a bit of a story in here that most of us are familiar with the young man falling out of the window and dying and Paul raising him again. So it is a story in Acts that most people, I think, remember because that one's a pretty impactful story as far as the death and the resurrection. But there's maybe a little more to this section that we don't see at first. All right, so let's just dive right into it because it's Monday morning and that's just the way I feel today. So 7 to 12 in the 20th chapter of Acts. On the first day of the week, when we met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them, since he intended to leave the next day. He continued speaking until midnight. There were many lamps in the room upstairs where we were meeting. A young man called Eutychus, who was sitting in the window, began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Overcome by sleep, he fell to the ground 3 floors below and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and, bending over him, took him in his arms and said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." Then Paul went upstairs, and after he had broken bread and eaten, he continued to converse with them until dawn. Then he left. Meanwhile, they had taken the boy away alive and were not a little bit comforted. They were greatly comforted. The NRSV, to me, that's kind of clumsily worded. They were not a little comforted. They were greatly comforted by this resurrection, Paul bringing this boy back to life. So, a couple things in there. First of all, this boy's Eutychus, his name, which reminds me of Utica, South Dakota, which is a very tiny town up in Yankton County of South Dakota. And I used to measure for a very short time. Right out of college, I was measuring fields up in that area. And so I remember Utica. I remember Utica is how you should pronounce it up there. Anyway, that's an aside. But today we have this story and this young man. Here we have on the first day of the week, it's Sunday, what we would call Sunday. And some point to this to the beginning of the establishment of Sunday as being our holy day rather than Sabbath day, which is sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday day, is the Jewish holy day. And of course, those times vary, don't they, from time to time? Because sunset is not stable. It moves as we go, as the seasons change. So, at any rate, and they're talking about they met to break bread. It's really what we have here is a bit of good morning, Phyllis. Good to see you online. The beginning of the establishment, perhaps, of our communion, what we deal with communion. But we have to remember that communion in the early days was a meal. It wasn't just the little wafer and the wine as we do now. And it's very paltry right now when we're using the little prefab cups, with the little tiny little rice cake in there that really isn't much. So looks like I skipped on the internet, so I hope that some of that went through. But here Paul is starting to talk to them after they've had their meal. They've met and had their meal. It's also important to remember that the institution of remember me is not just when we're having communion. It's supposed to be every time we eat, folks. And I've talked about that. It's every meal. And whenever you eat, remember me. So that's one of the reasons why I think we have grace during our meals. All right, but anyway, Paul is talking to them, and my gosh, we had Reverend Jim Mullen here yesterday for our Church Appreciation Day. He's part of the Billy Graham crusade. He was here. He spoke for roughly 40 minutes, and I know that some people were going, "Oh my gosh, that's a long sermon." And 40 minutes is a fairly long sermon by many modern day standards. I don't preach 40 minutes. I don't think I've ever preached a 40-minute sermon. Nobody would listen to me that long. But at any rate, if we think that's long, Paul's preaching from sundown to sunset, or sunrise. So he's pulling an all-nighter here, as they say. So after they have a meal, they sit down and they begin to preach. And it's gotten dark. They have lamps in the room. And as when someone is listening to sermons, most all of us can relate to dozing off during a sermon, especially if we have been tired that day or what have you. This young man, Eutychus, made a fairly poor decision in sitting in a third-story window. And he is nodded off, and you know how that reflex action, when you start to nod off, you jerk back, and there's actually a name for that reflex. I forget what it is called, but and as a result, he falls from the building and is pronounced dead. And of course, we have to remember that this is one of the we sections. Luke is involved in this, and so whether Luke is the one that went over and pronounced him dead or not, Luke is the great physician, and Luke is there, or is the physician, and he's there during all of this, because he says we in here. And Paul, here in the NRSV, it says he bent down and took him in his arms. Some translations, he falls on him and covers him, and then says do not be alarmed for the life is in him. This is, in some ways, we've got a communion story at the beginning of this. We have a resurrection story here. So we have a baptism, almost a baptismal kind of a thing going on here. Risen again into Christ, because he comes back to a life, and the boy is fine. So, but Paul goes back upstairs, and he continues to preach. Doesn't even allow someone falling out of a window to more than momentarily interrupt the message there. That's very, very, very interesting. But I think the story that we get out of this is this is where we first learned that Paul was actually Baptist, because only a Baptist can preach for all-nighter. That's not true, but that's a joke. But no, we just have the bringing in of the remembering the communion meal, remembering the resurrection. So there's more to it than just the boy being, the sadness of the boy falling out. It's the joy of the resurrection and being brought back to life. It's Paul somewhat being remembrant of some of the miracles that Peter's done early on in Acts, and here Paul is doing them. So Paul's really the equal of all of the apostles. He's not a second tier apostle by any means. He's just as good as Peter. So that's really what I've got for you today. We will continue with Paul's journey tomorrow. And please have a blessed day. And please be a blessing to someone today. Tell them about Jesus if you can. Bye-bye.